So we were previously just talking about how successful the studios had become by the 1920s. And the era of the late 20s through the 1930s and into the early 40s is uh, regarded as the golden age of Hollywood or the classical Hollywood cinema in film studies. And I'm going to talk about now what exactly that means, why it was called that. It doesn't really have to do necessarily with the films themselves. It more has to do with the status of the studios and how movies were made at that period of time in Hollywood. So this was the era of the studio system. The studio system dominated. And what that essentially means is that everything was done uh, in making the picture as well as distributing it and screening it by the studio itself. In other words, it was all produced in-house from the people that wrote the movie, the people that starred in the movie, the people that directed the movie, the people that edited the movie, the people that designed the clothes. All those people worked for the studio. And then once that movie was done, it also continued within the studio system. Now, the term for this in business is vertical integration. Vertical integration means when you have companies that are all owned by the same larger company, and they control a variety of different related businesses. In the case of the film business, the studios were vertically integrated, but they controlled all of the production of the film. They did everything in-house, as I said, but they also distributed the films, sent the films out to be exhibited in their own theaters. So that's vertical integration because they control these three key stages: the production of the films, the distribution of the films, and then the exhibition of the films. Now, we tend to glamorize and focus on the production of films because obviously, yes, that's incredibly important, making movies. But it has been for a very long time this second stage, the one that's kind of easy to forget, distribution, that is really the key to successful film making. Because if you produce a movie but you can't get it to theaters, it's a failure. Those companies that successfully distribute films or that control the distribution of films are the ones that are the most successful. And Hollywood has not only controlled the production of films, but also their distribution throughout the world for a very long time. So, in that golden age, the studios did all these things: production, distribution, exhibitions. You would go see a film in often a theater that was owned by the very company that produced it. So, this golden age, as I said, goes from the late 20s into the very early 50s. In fact, it's a very quick decline after the mid 1940s. During that era, there were what were called the Big Five studios: Loews, MGM, Paramount, Fox, Warner Brothers, and RKO. And only a couple of these, of course, are still around now. And now they aren't their own just major company. They're a part of a huge multinational conglomerate. So those were our big five companies, and then some of them don't even exist, like RKO. And then there were what were called the little three, or the mini majors: Universal, Columbia, and United Artists. So these were all the studios in that golden era that were making films that were distributed throughout the country, and they were all making them this way, in-house, producing them themselves and distributing them to theaters. So that golden age, as I said, lasts until the mid 1940s, that 1946 era, which is when the movie going peaks. From the late 50s into the 1960s, the studios are really in decline, and there's a couple of major reasons for that. One is that they no longer can do business in this manner of vertical integration. For many years, the government had been pursuing an antitrust case against the Hollywood studios because their control of the business, their control of all those different aspects, production, distribution, and exhibition, made it very difficult for independent or new filmmakers to get started in the business, to break into the business. Following World War II, there is finally a judgment in the case called U.S. versus Paramount. It was actually against the five major studios. Paramount just happened to be the first one listed, so it's known as U.S. versus Paramount. And this case resulted in what's known as the divestiture agreement. The divestiture agreement said that the studios had to divest themselves. They had to get rid of one of these major arms: production, distribution, or exhibition. So you can guess, as I said before, they all decided to keep production, to keep distribution, and they got rid of exhibition. They sold off all their theaters. So in addition to this meant that they don't have as sure of a way of making money, and there's going to be increased competition as well. They come up with different strategies to try to alleviate the financial difficulties. One is that they turn to co-production and increasing independent production. No longer will they fund the making of movies entirely themselves. They will look to outside investors and outside producers to come to the studios already having money, and then the studios would partner with them and give them resources such as letting them shoot on the lot and things like that. And therefore, you have this new era of co-production rather than everything being done in-house. In terms of movie making, that is, movies from the audience's standpoint, the exhibition of films moves from the city centers, which had been the case during the classic era, to the suburbs. This is part of the general post-war movement. After World War II, much of the populations in the city began to move to the suburbs outside the cities, and the movie theaters follow them. They move out of the cities into the suburbs. Other things happening. As I said, there are really two major blows that occur to the studios, the first being the divestiture agreement, but the other really important thing is TV. TV means that there is a new major competitor with films, and that people almost immediately in the late 1940s are staying home and watching TV relatively for free rather than going and paying to see films. The movies respond by doing a number of different things, some of which are basically gimmicks to try to play up the experience of going to film and doing things that TV can't do. This is the era of 3D. There was also something called smell-o-vision, where you could smell the movies. But also importantly, that's when the shift to widescreen occurs. You'll remember we talked about that in our cinematography unit, how the aspect ratio changed. That was all about playing up the uniqueness of the film theater experience, that you could see not just a much bigger screen, but a much wider one as well. So these things help to kind of mediate the losses that the film industry is experiencing. But the bottom line is that you have a real decline in film going by the end of the 1960s. There's much more reliance on co-productions and independent productions, but the studios still exist. The problem is the people that are running the studios are the same old executives, and they are really out of touch with the taste of audiences, particularly the younger audiences, those baby boomers that are coming of age, who've grown up in a very different world. They listen to rock music, and the politics of the time have really changed the way they make sense of their own lives, and they aren't going to see the same old kind of movies. I'll post some links in the units that should be entertaining for you to watch. There's two different trailers that I think you'll find entertaining from 1969. One is for the musical starring Clint Eastwood, Paint Your Wagon. This was an example of a studio production, an attempt to make movies the old-fashioned way, and it was a tremendous flop. You'll get to enjoy hearing Clint Eastwood sing if you watch that thing. The other that you're going to see was a huge hit. It was Easy Rider, made by and starring this new generation. And if I'm going to keep my mouth shut so I don't spoil it too much, but that was a film that was an independent production and took all kinds of chances and really showed the studios that they had to let new people come in and make decisions and make movies. So at the beginning of the 70s, faced with this dramatic loss in audiences, they did some predictable things like incorporating more violence and more sex into films in the early 70s. There's a tremendous amount more than that than you would see even in the 60s. and they start to empower younger executives and younger filmmakers to make movies that they think audiences will like, some of which are very successful and some of which are not successful. In terms of the films themselves, the old guidelines for how you portrayed good and bad, the production code of the past, all that is history. So there's a greater ambiguity in films at this time. Not all of them, but a lot of them. There's an increased tolerance for movies that tend to blur the line between good and bad characters, heroes and anti-heroes. There's more ambiguity in films in the 70s. So, this era is called the New Hollywood. Once these young executives and filmmakers have kind of taken over Hollywood, now this is called the New Hollywood. The studios are a thing of the past. Even though they exist, the old way of making films does not exist anymore. So some of the most well-known directors of this era, those that would be called auteurs, in the sense of directors who have a kind of vision and a consistency amongst them films, are people like Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Brian De Palma. All these people are very young and successful in the 1970s. Now, I just got one more slide and then we'll finish up this particular video. Things start to change. Now, the 70s is looked to by many people as a different kind of golden era of cinema. A golden era not because of how the studio did business, but a golden era because these directors had so much power to make the kinds of films they wanted to make. And that was, again, basically because the old executives didn't know what audiences wanted, so they trusted these younger people to make films that would appeal to them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The problem was that these really kind of idiosyncratic films couldn't be depended upon to have really broad mass appeal. At the same time, during the 1970s, the studios are all bought out and part of these multinational conglomerates. They're very much focused on the bottom line. And when there are some major failures of these director-oriented films, they start to exert more control. They want more reliable money-making films to be made. And what happens is there are a couple of films that are hugely successful in the late 70s. You've probably even seen them, and if you haven't, you should, for historical purposes, not just entertainment purposes. And those films are Jaws and Star Wars. Jaws, directed by Steven Spielberg, Star Wars, directed by George Lucas. And these blockbusters showed that you could make movies that were so hugely popular and also popular in other countries that you didn't have to worry about making a whole bunch of small films that were idiosyncratic, that met a lot of different people's tastes. You could just have these big, mega successful blockbusters. That's why they were called blockbusters. And they could ensure enough money that you would have a successful year just through one film. The other thing about blockbusters, because they tended to be these very entertainment-oriented and action-oriented films, is that they provided lots of opportunity for what's called cross-promotion, where you enter into relationships with fast food restaurants or cereals or other merchandisers, where they advertise your film and then they pay for the right to do that. So there's different ways of making money. And then Star Wars especially showed how you could make a tremendous amount of money through merchandising. Star Wars made a lot of money. It made a lot more money through selling Star Wars toys. And it was the movie that really did that, again, on a huge scale. There had been merchandising before, but not on the level of Star Wars. So, the funny thing about the 1970s is by the end of the decade, your attitude about movies and whether this has all been a good or a bad thing kind of depends on what your tastes are. One way to look at it is that, well, films have really evolved to be this mass, giant blockbuster appeal, and that's a good thing. Or, unfortunately, also what we saw is that the kinds of really interesting films that were made in the 1970s that didn't have a huge audiences yet explored boundaries, things like Martin Scorsese's films, for example. They're much more difficult to make after the end of the 1970s. The scene becomes, during the 1980s, in a lot of ways, boring. That is, by the end of the 1970s, the studios are not making kinds of independent films, and instead, we have the birth of what's called truly indie cinema. That becomes where we have the more director-oriented filmmakings, films that are made completely outside the studio system, although the studios will end up distributing them.